West Germany, June 1974. The FIFA World Cup is the largest sporting event on Earth. 17 nations, 64 days of football across 9 West German cities, 2 million spectators, a television audience of 1 billion people across the globe. And somewhere in that crowd, somewhere in the 77,000 people packed into Munich's Olympiastadion for the final between West Germany and the Netherlands, a man from Harlem is sitting very still, watching the game, thinking about something that has nothing to do with football. He has flown from New York to Frankfurt. He has checked into a hotel under a name that is not his name. He is carrying, in a bag that has passed through airport security without incident, in ways that a customs officer would find interesting and a federal prosecutor would find relevant, more cash than most people in the stadium will earn in a year. He has come a long way from the corner table at Frank's Steakhouse on 116th Street. He has not come this far to watch football. 2 years later, a DEA analyst in a federal building in Lower Manhattan is reviewing a stack of surveillance photographs. Most of them are from Harlem, from Newark, from the standard geographies of the Frank Lucas investigation. One of them is from West Germany. The analyst stares at it for a long time. Then he picks up the phone. The photograph shows a man in a stadium. Around him, 77,000 people watching football. The man is not watching football. He is talking to someone the frame barely captures, a hand, a shoulder, the edge of a face that the analyst will spend 3 weeks trying to identify. The analyst writes a name on a post-it note. He sticks it to the photograph. The name is Frank Lucas. The trip that nobody was supposed to know about has been found. What it means, what Frank Lucas was doing in West Germany in the summer of 1974, who he was talking to in that stadium, what the cash in the bag was for. This is the story that the Frank Lucas mythology has never fully told, because it is the story of how the invisible empire was thinking about becoming something larger, something international, something that would have made everything that came before look like a rehearsal. To understand what Frank Lucas was looking for in West Germany in the summer of 1974, you need to understand what had just happened to the global heroin trade. In January 1972, the Nixon administration had declared a war on drugs, a political declaration that, whatever its moral or policy merits, had one immediate and concrete operational consequence. The DEA was funded, organized, and directed to attack the heroin supply chain at its source rather than simply at the street level. The primary target was the French Connection, the supply chain that had dominated American heroin markets since the 1950s. Corsican criminal networks, working through Marseille's sophisticated drug processing infrastructure, had been converting Turkish opium into high-grade heroin and moving it through established channels to American distributors, primarily the Italian-American organized crime families who controlled wholesale distribution. By 1972 and 1973, the French Connection was under unprecedented pressure. The DEA's international operations, working with French authorities, with Turkish law enforcement, with Interpol, had disrupted the supply chain at multiple points simultaneously. Processing laboratories in Marseille were raided. Transit routes were compromised. Key figures in the Corsican network were arrested. The French Connection did not disappear overnight. But it was wounded. Supply was inconsistent. Quality was declining. Prices were rising. The American heroin market, which had been reliably supplied by the Marseille pipeline for 2 decades, was experiencing supply disruptions that created, in the specific logic of markets, an opportunity. A supply disruption in a market with inelastic demand, demand that does not decrease proportionally when supply falls, creates enormous profit potential for whoever can fill the gap. Frank Lucas had been filling a version of this gap since 1968 with his Southeast Asian sourcing. Blue Magic's extraordinary purity was partly a function of the direct sourcing, product that had not been stepped on by multiple distribution layers. But it was also a function of the French Connection's reliability, having kept competing product at a consistent quality standard that Frank Lucas's product exceeded. When the French Connection weakened, the opportunity did not simply scale Frank Lucas's existing operation. It opened something more significant, the possibility of repositioning the Blue Magic operation not as a niche premium product in the American market, but as the primary replacement for the supply chain that the French Connection had provided. This required something Frank Lucas had not yet built: European infrastructure. The Southeast Asian sourcing moved product to the United States. But the French connection had also served European markets, had supplied the heroin trade in Britain, in West Germany, in the Netherlands, in Italy. As the French connection weakened, those European markets were also experiencing supply disruptions. Frank Lucas was a man who read markets. He read this one. West Germany, in the summer of 1974, was not simply the host of the World Cup. It was a node in the shifting geography of the European drug trade, a country with established Turkish immigrant communities who had existing connections to the Turkish opium production that the French connection had historically processed. A country with a heroin market that was growing and undersupplied, a country where the post-French connection reorganization of supply was still being worked out. Frank Lucas went to the World Cup. He also went to West Germany. Operational security was, for Frank Lucas, not a tactic. It was a philosophy. The specific genius of the invisible empire had always been the deliberate mismatch between what Frank Lucas was doing and what he appeared to be doing. The brown suit at the corner table, the neck bones at the restaurant where the Italian mobster ate steaks. The ordinary face in the extraordinary circumstance. The 1974 World Cup provided cover that was, in its way, perfect. 2 million spectators descended on West Germany over 8 weeks. They came from every country that had qualified and from dozens that had not. They moved through airports, hotels, restaurants, and stadiums in quantities that overwhelmed the surveillance capacity of any security apparatus. The noise of 2 million people, all with legitimate reasons to be in the same place, all moving through the same infrastructure simultaneously, created a specific kind of operational chaos that was, for someone who needed to be somewhere without being noticed, ideal. Frank Lucas was not the only operator who understood this. The use of major international sporting events as cover for criminal logistics, for meetings, for money transfers, for the establishment of new relationships, is documented across multiple investigations of multiple organizations across multiple decades. The World Cup, the Olympics, major boxing matches, events that bring large numbers of people together in ways that overwhelm normal surveillance create environments where the specific anomaly of one man meeting another man and exchanging information is invisible in the crowd. Frank Lucas had used the Super Bowl this way. Not deliberately, the Super Bowl appearance had been motivated by Julie, not by operational logic, and had backfired spectacularly by making him visible rather than using the crowd as cover. He had learned from that. The World Cup was different. Frank Lucas was not wearing a chinchilla coat. He was not sitting in visible seats. He was in the crowd, genuinely in the crowd, indistinguishable from the 2 million other people with reasons to be in West Germany that summer. The cash he had brought served multiple potential purposes. Meeting expenses, the kind of cash that facilitates certain kinds of introductions in certain kinds of worlds. Operational seed capital, the beginning of a financial relationship with people who needed to be paid before they would commit. Due diligence funding, the cost of investigating whether a new supply relationship was what it appeared to be before committing to it. The specific use of the cash on this trip is not fully documented. Frank Lucas has been characteristically imprecise about this period in his various public accounts, not evasive in a way that suggests he has something specific to hide, but vague in the way that someone is vague about details that they have never organized for public consumption. What is documented is that he was there, that he met with people, that the people he met with were not American, and that within 18 months of the trip, the DEA's investigation of Frank Lucas had begun to find threads that led to European connections it had not previously identified. The threads did not lead to a completed European operation. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975, 8 months after the World Cup final. Whatever infrastructure he had been building in West Germany did not survive to be built out. But the intention was real. The trip was real. And the gap it was trying to fill, the hole in the global heroin supply chain left by the French connection's disruption, was real and was eventually filled by someone. The photograph in the DEA file shows Frank Lucas in a stadium. The partial face beside him, the hand, the shoulder, the edge of a profile, was identified, after 3 weeks of analytical work, as a man named Kemal Arslan. Kemal Arslan was a Turkish-German businessman. He had arrived in West Germany in 1962 as part of the Gastarbeiter program, the guest worker recruitment through which West Germany had filled its post-war labor shortage with workers from Turkey, Yugoslavia, Greece, and other southern European and Mediterranean countries. He had worked initially in a factory in Stuttgart. By 1974, he was operating several businesses in Frankfurt, a restaurant, an import-export company, a small construction firm. None of these businesses was large enough to explain the life Kamal Arslan appeared to be living. The DEA knew Arslan as a peripheral figure in European drug intelligence, a name that appeared in various reports as a possible intermediary between Turkish opium networks and European distribution, but a name without sufficient documented connections to justify priority investigative attention. He was, in the language of intelligence analysis, a potential node in a network that had not yet been fully mapped. Why was Frank Lucas talking to Kamal Arslan at the World Cup? The explanation that the DEA's analysis produced was straightforward, if speculative. Arslan was a connection to the Turkish supply networks that the French connection had historically used. With the French connection disrupted, those Turkish networks needed new pathways to market. Frank Lucas was building a pathway, not the Marseille processing route, but something different. Something that would use his existing Southeast Asian sourcing infrastructure as a model, adapted to a European supply chain. The meeting was preliminary. Introductory. Frank Lucas was not, in a single conversation in a Munich stadium, establishing a new international drug network. He was making an assessment. Was Arslan who he appeared to be? Were the connections he represented real? Was the opportunity that the French connection's disruption had created one that could be accessed through this particular intermediary? These are the questions that a man of Frank Lucas's operational intelligence would have been asking, quietly, carefully, in the noise of 77,000 people watching football. The assessment, apparently, was positive enough to continue. Further meetings were arranged, not at the World Cup but afterward, through intermediaries, in ways that were more carefully managed than a stadium conversation could be. These further meetings are documented only fragmentarily in the DEA files, which were assembled around the Frank Lucas arrest and trial, and therefore focused on what could be proved for the prosecution, rather than what could be mapped for intelligence purposes. What can be said is this. Frank Lucas saw something in West Germany in the summer of 1974 that he thought was worth pursuing. He was right that there was an opportunity. He was wrong that he had enough time to develop it before Richie Roberts closed the case. 8 months later, federal agents knocked on his door in Teaneck. The European operation died before it was born. The cash Frank Lucas carried to West Germany was not simply travel money. In 1974, the movement of large amounts of cash across international borders was regulated but not comprehensively monitored. The Bank Secrecy Act had been passed in 1970, requiring U.S. banks to report cash transactions over $10,000, but the act's implementation was incomplete. Its enforcement was inconsistent, and the specific international dimension of cash movement was not yet addressed by the regulatory infrastructure that would develop over subsequent decades. A man carrying cash through an international airport in 1974 faced customs declarations and occasional searches, but not the comprehensive financial surveillance that would eventually make large cash movements detectable and traceable. The cash could move. It could be moved in ways that produced no documentary trail. It could be used to establish relationships, make payments, and create the financial foundations of new operational arrangements without entering any system that law enforcement could monitor. This was not unique to Frank Lucas. The 1970s were the heyday of international cash movement for criminal purposes, a period before the financial surveillance infrastructure that the drug war eventually produced had been built. When the international financial system had not yet developed the anti-money laundering frameworks that would eventually make large cash movements traceable. Frank Lucas understood this environment with the same precision he brought to every operational detail. He also understood something more specific about the European financial environment of 1974, the specific utility of Switzerland. Swiss banking secrecy in 1974 was absolute in ways that it would not remain. A numbered account in a Swiss bank received deposits, made payments, and maintained balances without any obligation to disclose the account holder's identity to any outside authority, including American law enforcement. The Swiss banking system was, in the early 1970s, the world's primary instrument for moving money across jurisdictions while breaking the documentary chain that connected criminal proceeds to their source. Frank Lucas's financial architecture, the complex, multi-layered system through which Blue Magic's revenue was managed and deployed, had, by various accounts, Swiss components. The specific details remain obscure, which is itself evidence of the system's effectiveness. The DEA's financial investigation of the Frank Lucas operation was, even with full cooperation after his arrest, unable to account for a significant portion of the operation's estimated revenues. Some of that money may still be somewhere. The West Germany trip, the cash, the meeting with Kamal Arslan, and whatever financial arrangements were made or contemplated in those 8 weeks. These represent a dimension of the Frank Lucas story that was never fully investigated because the investigation that existed was oriented toward the American operation, and the European threads were cut when Frank Lucas was arrested before the European operation had produced actionable evidence. What would have happened if he had had more time? This is the question that makes the 1974 World Cup trip genuinely significant in the Frank Lucas story. Not as a completed chapter, but as an indicator of direction, of where the invisible empire was going before Richie Roberts closed the distance. The answer, based on the opportunity that existed and the capabilities Frank Lucas had demonstrated, is not reassuring. The man who had gone directly to Southeast Asia when everyone else was going through Italian middlemen was now looking at Europe when the conventional operators were still trying to reconstruct the French connection. He was, as always, ahead of where everyone else was looking. He was just out of time. Let us reckon with what the European operation represented. The French connection had supplied heroin to American and European markets for 2 decades. Its disruption in the early 1970s was a genuine law enforcement achievement. It reduced supply, raised prices, and created conditions under which some users sought treatment because the product was unavailable or unaffordable. These effects were temporary. The market adapted. New supply chains were eventually built. The heroin trade reorganized itself, as markets do, around the disruption that law enforcement had created. What Frank Lucas was proposing to build, in the meetings at the World Cup and the preliminary arrangements that followed, was a new supply chain that would fill the gap the French connection had left in both American and European markets, with products sourced from the same Southeast Asian networks that Blue Magic came from. If it had worked, it would have accelerated the market's recovery from the French connection's disruption. It would have maintained heroin availability in American cities during a period when that availability was declining. It would have introduced Blue Magic quality product into European markets that were experiencing their own supply disruptions. The human cost of this, measured in addiction, in overdose deaths, in the devastation that the product had already demonstrated its capacity to produce in Baltimore and Newark and Harlem, would have been proportional to the scale of the operation. An international operation. A European market. A supply chain that connected Southeast Asian production to American and European street-level distribution through an organizational model that had already demonstrated it could operate for years against the full resources of American federal law enforcement. The DEA's arrest of Frank Lucas in January 1975 did not simply stop the existing American operation. It stopped, before it started, what the existing operation was evolving into. This is never part of the Frank Lucas mythology. The mythology is oriented toward what was built, not toward what was prevented from being built. But the trip to West Germany in the summer of 1974, the man in the stadium, the cash in the bag, the conversation with the man whose face is barely visible in a DEA photograph, represents something real. It represents what happens when a man of extraordinary organizational intelligence and complete moral flexibility looks at a disrupted market and sees an opportunity. It represents what Richie Roberts prevented. It represents the cost, in human terms, of 8 more months. Frank Lucas was arrested in January 1975. Kamal Arslan was never charged in connection with the Frank Lucas investigation. The European threads identified by DEA analysts were not sufficient for prosecution. Arslan continued operating his businesses in Frankfurt for several years. He appears in various European drug intelligence reports through the late 1970s and early 1980s as a peripheral figure, never the subject of a successful prosecution. The gap left by the French connection was eventually filled, not by Frank Lucas, by the Turkish networks that Arslan represented, organized through different channels and different operators, by the Colombian cocaine networks that were beginning to develop in the late 1970s and would, in the 1980s, transformed the American drug market more completely than heroin ever had, by the ongoing adaptation of criminal supply chains to law enforcement pressure that has characterized the drug trade through every decade since. The opportunity Frank Lucas saw was real. His assessment of the market was correct. His identification of the European connection as the next strategic direction for the operation was, by the standards of drug trade intelligence, accurate. He was just 8 months too slow. Richie Roberts closed the case. The European operation died in a West German stadium, in the noise of 77,000 people watching football, in a conversation that a DEA analyst would spend 3 weeks reconstructing from a photograph of a man whose face was barely visible at the edge of the frame. Frank Lucas watched the World Cup final. West Germany beat the Netherlands 2-1. He flew home. 8 months later, federal agents knocked on his door before dawn. The most expensive seat in the world had not bought what he went to West Germany to buy. It had bought him, instead, 8 months of operating under an investigation that was now pursuing European threads alongside the American ones, 8 months during which the walls closed faster than they might otherwise have closed. The 1974 World Cup. The trip nobody was supposed to know about. The operation that never was. The market that someone else eventually filled. And a DEA photograph in a federal file in Lower Manhattan, with a post-it note in the margin. 2 words. Frank Lucas.